Hi, I'm Joy Roberts, one of the co founders of Frenzy, and we are so grateful to be here with you today. I'm here along with my good friend, Dr. Marcella Chiromo, and we are talking about a very important topic of trauma. This is near and dear to our hearts at Frenzy. For me specifically, I was one of those students who walked into school carrying trauma. And it was because of caring teachers like you all that in part I was able to navigate those challenges. And so this conversation is important and meaningful. We know many students or we ourselves are familiar with what it is to walk into a classroom with trauma, and how we respond as educators really matters.
Hi, everyone. So let's look at what we're going to look at today. The first thing that we're going to do is to understand trauma. We're also going to look at the developmental impact of trauma and then ways that we can actually respond.
So, we want to start with the very important question of why does trauma matter so much for us as educators?
Yeah, so trauma matters to us as educators because we care about students and how it actually impacts the learning. So we teach the whole student, right? We know that students come in with different parts of who they are. They live outside of the school, so they're bringing their lives outside of the school into the classroom, into the school. And educators play a critical role in supporting academics, the social emotional well-being as well. This model, the whole child model, is proven to improve educational outcomes, which is what we want to see in students. It also trauma impacts learning, right? So we know that research shows trauma negatively it affects the educational outcomes, which is why we want to bring awareness of how to recognize and respond to this. It can interfere with things like focusing, engagement, and academic success overall.
So, we know that trauma matters and impacts students and their ability to learn. And as educators who care deeply about our students, we want to be informed so that we can show up at our highest and best. So, let's talk about what is a shared definition or shared understanding of what trauma means. So, what's the definition of trauma?
Yeah, so according to the DSM, trauma is a psychological, so that means the thinking, our behaviors, and or emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. I want to point out with this definition that two people can experience one situation and experience it differently. So it's important that we recognize that it has an impact on us individually.
So, when we think about this idea of trauma and we think about our students specifically, two students might experience the same event, but their personal responses can be very different. So, what matters most is impact, whether it leaves a lasting mark on how someone feels, how they think, or how they function. So, when we think about trauma, it isn't just about an obvious event, it's about how that event, scenario, situation affected that person or that student.
It's exactly. So if we look at how trauma impacts us, we can see it in different ways. So, for instance, if we look at the emotional side of things, we notice emotional dysregulation or heightened reactions. So, as well as physical things that we might see is illness or just stress in the body. So, for instance, you might see a headache, a stomach ache, and so on. Behavioral sort of indicators that we might see are things like withdrawal, acting out, or inconsistent participation. We also see things on the cognitive side in terms of memory challenges and even just difficulty paying attention.
So, when we think about how trauma manifests, it is not only about a traumatic event, but it can be something that is witnessed by a student. And so I think that's a really important distinction. Trauma can come from what is personally experienced, but it also can come from what is witnessed or observed by an individual. So, when we think about the most common types of trauma that our students may be carrying into our classroom, we have a few categories or lists that we want to unpack together. Again, this is all about us being aware as educators and informed.
Yeah, so when we look at common types of trauma, we know of natural disasters, which are becoming more common. So things like a hurricane, wildfires, floods. And these events tend to disrupt like students' living situation. So that might be impacted and that might cause significant trauma. Abuse, the one that we hear a lot. So we look at physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, we also see indicators in terms of behavior and emotions if a student is experiencing that. Another is medical illness. So this might be the student experiencing this personally, or maybe a loved one who's experiencing a medical illness. And this may not be, this may create a sense of fear and just unknowing whether this person or themselves are going to get better. So we might notice that it impacts them in the classroom as well. School violence, and particularly when we look at, for instance, bullying. Bullying as a school, it would be considered school violence. If you think about a student who is maybe coming to your math class and is fearful of the bully that is in that same class, um, to them, that is a very unsafe environment for them, or their bully is at the school. The school itself is unsafe. So we might be expecting a student to focus, to do their math, but what they're thinking about is safety.
When we think about school safety, I think, Marcella, you looked internally in this idea of bullying or social aggression that is happening that can cause fear, anxiety, and trauma. We also see in the news regularly on gun violence and school shootings. And so when we think of trauma, it's important to remember that not all trauma is visible. And so even though this may not have occurred at your school, there is still fear attached to that. So there may be school hesitation, there may be anxiety and stress that manifests from that. And it's on the news. Students are seeing it, they're hearing about it, they're running drills. And so that is a layer of trauma that we can acknowledge and work to create safety structures of safety and security around that. That leads really into community violence. And so this can include anything from gang activities, protests that turn violent. Again, they're in the news, even hearing gunshots in the neighborhood. And again, social media, news feeds, these are all impacting our students in very real ways, and they're carrying that into the classroom.
Yes, and other ways that we might see is grief and loss of a loved one. Um, but this might also look like loss of relationship, a friend, that we may not even consider that to be grief or loss. You might notice some of the behaviors that we mentioned or the emotional indicators that this person, the friendship, the relationship might have been really important to that student. So we might see them um, getting impacted by that. Domestic violence, whether they're experiencing it themselves or they're watching somebody else experience that, which goes along with actually also watching others go through trauma, especially if it's young ones. They tend to maybe internalize what they're seeing, what they're noticing. So we may also see, maybe behavioral, emotional aspects show up or manifest just by watching someone else go through trauma.
So again, trauma is often invisible, but it's real. It affects every part of a student's life, their relationships, their behavior, and again, the learning. So today is more about than just building our awareness level. It's about putting some tools in our toolbox. And so I think it's important to remember you don't have to be a counselor to make a difference. You can be that caring adult who sees, who listens, and who responds in ways that help students feel safe and supported and connected to. So, how we care, how you and I care as educators is a really powerful tool. It actually, and again, from my own personal experience, can impact the trajectory of a student's life. And so, this conversation is really about how do we show up with compassion and courage? Because when we understand trauma, we're not just helping students survive, we're actually creating conditions and environments for them to heal, to learn, and to grow through that process.